Hey guys, what is up? My name's Thomas. I'm the author of the project file. So let's take a look at some before and afters using this product. You can see from the demo that all we have to do is brush over an area and we have these really elegant, beautiful particles that come based on the source that you select. So you can see in here that these are basically straight out of the box examples, but we're going to go over them in detail in this tutorial. So let's begin in step one by just positioning our source how we want it within here. So I'm going to select the layer and hit S for scale, and we're going to scale this down. I'm actually going to go and I'm just going to bring my mouse wheel back, and that will zoom out a little bit. Now we can more clearly see the full dimensions. And I'm going to hit P, and we can move the position over and up, or we can just click and drag it within this panel. And I'm going to scale it down, hitting S and down on there. I'll kind of try and line it up how I had it in the preview video. Something like that. That's pretty close. So now step one is done. Let's go to step two. So the first thing when we go into step two is we want to make sure that our current time indicator is on frame 0. So if it's anywhere else other than frame 0, the first thing you want to do is grab it and bring it to frame 0 where it says brush here. Now let's work with the brush tool. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the top to this brush icon right up here and click on that. Now that's going to bring up two panels. It's going to bring up the brush panel and the paint panel, and it should come up by default, but if it doesn't, go up to the top to window and then brushes and then window and paint, and that'll bring those two up. Okay. Now what we want to do is let's just make sure our brush and paint settings are the same. So I'm going to bring this over just a little bit, and we'll start in the paint panel. So you want to make sure that your settings are the exact same as mine. Opacity at 100 and 100, mode set on normal, and this is the most important one. Channels is set to alpha. You don't want it on RGBA or RGB. You want it on alpha. Okay, and then finally, you want this on constant. And this should be black in the foreground and white in the background, but if not, you can kind of play around with this to make sure that is correct and black is in the foreground. And then for the brush settings, we want the diameter. We can customize this later. Angle at 0. Roundness at 100, hardness at 0, spacing should be at default at 25%, but you can turn that off if you want as well to have tighter spacing. I'll just leave it on for now though. And then the brush dynamics and all these other settings set to off. So now we have our brush and paint settings all set the same. We're gonna go to our layer with the brush tool selected and double click. And that will allow us to brush directly on that composition, which is what we want. So I'm gonna zoom in just a little bit by moving my mouse wheel in. And then what I'm going to do is before I start brushing, I'm going to change the mode just a little bit so it looks more like it's in Photoshop. In the middle, we have these three dudes, and the one has a red icon. It's the toggle alpha overlay. We're going to click on that, and we're going to set the opacity to 100%. So if you have everything set up how it is right now, it'll look very similar to Photoshop. And the last thing before we start brushing is I just want to show you how to change the brush diameter. You can manually do it by adjusting the diameter right here, up or down, and that will change the brush size. But the faster way is the hotkey. On a Mac, if you hold Command, or on a PC, Control, you click and on the left mouse button, drag up or down. That will allow you to change the brush size, which is really slick and honestly pretty fast to edit with. So now all we have to do is just brush over. So we're going to keep brushing over our subject that we want to have the effect applied to. Just going to kind of brush the outside. You can brush it however you want, but there are some best practices that I would recommend. So let's just say, for example, I'll undo all that. I wouldn't recommend having really thin lines like this. Like that just won't look very good. So we'll undo that. And I don't recommend having your subject take up most of the screen. That won't look good either. We just kind of want a nice middle ground where the subject is clearly in focus but not taking up the whole screen or a tiny little part of it. So then the next step, now that we have this done, is we need to go out of this kind of brush mode that we're in where we're adjusting the layer. Hit the X on this tab and that'll close this layer with a brush that we're working with is. So I'll do that. And then now when we are back in our step 2 isolate, we'll notice that it's not all gray anymore. It's actually colored, which is what we want. And we set this up this way so that you can clearly see where it is that you brushed. Okay, so that's looking really nice. That's exactly what we want. Next, we're going to go to step 3, focal areas. And notice right away, again, the current time indicator is not on frame 0, it's on frame 37. So we want to click and drag that back to frame 0 where it says brush here. When you're working with the Shimmer Motion Kit, you want to make sure that you brush focal areas that you want the viewer's eyes to go to. So what I mean by that is, let's say in this example, I would say a focal area would be her face. And another focal area might be like right here on her scarf, because there's some nice contrast and detail on this the thread that's coming off. And that's what you kind of want to look for with this. So if the face was close up, you might want to have the focal area be the eye. And how we're going to be doing this is the exact same as before. We're just brushing where the focal areas are. So with the current time indicator on frame 0, I'm going to double click that layer again. So now we're editing the layer directly, and I'm just going to brush over the face and maybe like right here. So we get that nice sharpness on the detail of the threads. So now that we have our areas covered, we're just going to hit X to close out that. So now we can see that we have this green overlay, and that's just to kind of help differentiate step 3 from step 2. So you can see clearly where you set your focal areas to if you want to go back and edit them later. Or in step 2, you can clearly see where you brushed on that. So in the next video, we're going to see our results and we're going to customize our results. All right, you guys, we are on tutorial number 6, customizing your results. So let's begin. We've already went through step 1, step 2, and step 3, and now we're ready to see our final results. So let's go into the example composition. And the first thing you'll note is that the current time indicator is on frame 0, so it's just showing us the filter on our main image. So from frame 0 to frame 120, it builds. And now at frame 120, where it says edit here, we have our final result, and it's looking really nice. Now within here, we have 4 main controllers. And it might seem like there's a lot, but we really narrowed this down to just the essentials that you need to get the best results possible. So the first one we have is this Shimmer Controller. Now by default, your effect controls panel probably looks like this. So what we want to do first is select any of the effects and hit Command A on a Mac or Control A on a PC and twirl them up. The ones that aren't quite self-explanatory are the emitter source. So this one, it's right here, this little crosshair. I want you to take, and if you're not seeing that, it might be because it's really small, but you might not be seeing it because you have View, Show Layer Controls not checked. So you want to make sure that's checked. And then we'll go back to the emitter source, select that, and you want to kind of drag that to wherever the middle of where you brushed is. And you don't have to do this step, but I recommend it. I think it gets a little bit better results because what it's doing is it's more evenly dispersing the particles based on where you brushed your subject in step 2. The next are all pretty self-explanatory for the main particle amount, speed, size, opacity. You can adjust all this stuff. The particle saturation, if you want it to be more saturated or less. The tint, you can change the particles to a specific color. The inner and outer range, there are particles that are close to the subject and particles that are farther away. So you can kind of play with those and move them out or in if you'd like. And you can adjust the random seed if you want to see what the particles, just keep playing with the numbers on this and it'll move the particles around and give you different results. The amount that the particles flicker, it's at 50% by default. So if you want it to flicker more, you could have it higher or lower. And how often they flicker. 7, I think, is a pretty good middle ground. I wouldn't suggest editing these unless you want to, you can. Now, I do want to go over these bottom effects individually with you because they're not quite self-explanatory. If we look at the subject close up, we have these mini particles that are around it. And by default, they go outward. But you can change them to rotate around the subject. So let me show you what that looks like in real time. I'll bring back up the demo and we'll hit play. So see how these particles are kind of going outward? Now watch on the hummingbird, they're rotating around it. So on the line, they're rotating around. And I believe on the dancer, they're rotating around too. So you can choose if you want to have them go outward or rotate around. I love the rotate around look. I think it looks really nice and I'm really happy with that one. The next we have the focal area particles. If we zoom in on the face, you can see that if I uncheck that, there's particles here that are going to disappear. And they're disappearing because we said in the focal areas, that's a focal area. So it's basically disabling them. And I can easily see people not wanting the mini particles on the focal area. And then finally, the filter animates in and out. So the loop is actually happening from frame 120 to 240. And that's a 4-second loop that's happening in the middle. But from frame 0 to 120, the effect is building on. And I can see how people might not want the effect to build on from the filter being on. Okay, so let's go to the scene controller. These are pretty self-explanatory. the brush softness and opacity that you selected in the isolation phase, that you can kind of blur it so it's not as hard of edges if you'd like. Now these next two, the foreground blur and background blur, the foreground is set by the step 2 where you're isolating your subject. So you can see if we set this amount from 10 to 0 that all the blur now is gone on the subject. So we'll put that back to 10 so you can see the difference again. And it's worth noting on this that in the focal area where you selected, there is no blur whatsoever there, no matter what this value is. Next we have the background blur, and that's the background blur. That's nothing difficult to explain. The auto tint, I do want to go over this one. In this example, if I turn auto tint off, you can see that this is what the results look like without auto tint. So it's way blown out. But with auto tint on, it basically can tell that the results are blown out, and it adjusts the tint accordingly. But you can easily go in the background tint and lower this value into negative digits or higher, so you can really customize those results. And the same thing goes for the auto boost on the subject. If I turn that off, you can see that it just kind of darkens it a little bit. And of course, you can go into the brushed area boost and put that to like 50, for example, and it'll really brighten up the subject that we selected. So turn that back down. The contrast and saturation are pretty straightforward. The color options, though, this is really cool. So now all you have to do to play around with 7 Styles color options is just twirl these down and uncheck them. So let's do color option 9, for example. That's one I used in the demo. So we can see this look. Looks really cool. Maybe we think this look is a little too strong. So you can go to color 9 opacity, and you can lower that manually to like 50%. But it's just really convenient to go in and kind of play around really quickly with the different looks from the results. So I'll bring that back to color 1. All right, so next we have the extras. Now this effect is being built by multiple particle effects to combine to make this final result. And we wanted to make sure you can still customize everything. So you can go in here and customize any of the different elements within the scene that's being built. You shouldn't really have to play around with this one too much, but just in case, I wanted to include it. And then finally, we have the camera controller. These are kind of more advanced settings here, and this one you should not even edit the loop part. But the motion frequency, you can edit this one. So let's say, for example, we wanted to create a loop, and by default, it has just a little bit of subtle sway and camera motion to it. But let's say we wanted that completely off. So you'd set this value from 0.5 to 0, and now there'll be no motion whatsoever from the camera. I would not recommend having this value any higher than 1. Alright you guys, so that's everything for customizing your results. In the next video, we're going to go over rendering options and what you can do with your renders. Alright you guys, we're in the last tutorial, rendering options. I just want to go over each rendering option that we have set up for you and some best practices and how I'd recommend using them in your projects. So let's dig into After Effects in the example project that we have set up, and we'll go into the render. And you can see that we have 5 main compositions that we're going to be working with: the hit, in, loop, out, loop, reveal, and timer map. Now I went and rendered out each one of these individually so you can see what they look like. So what we're going to be doing is looking in Premiere at these in real time, and then kind of digging back in After Effects so you can see any customization things you might want to take note of. Okay, so let's start with a hit. We'll go into Premiere, and I'll take the hit render and we'll bring it into the timeline and play it back. So we can see first off, I'm going to pause it, that we have this really nice background, and this background is customizable. And I'll show you that in just a second, but we'll continue playing it. And you can see that it has this nice hit that comes at the camera. And this is the exact camera move that I used in the demo for the different ones at the beginning and some towards the end of the video as well. So it's a really aggressive move. And what I recommend this for is like trailers, more aggressive trailers. So what you do is you would lay your audio track in Premiere, and then you would just render out a bunch of different of these hits using the Shimmer Motion Kit. And you can just kind of play with the duration of them and get them to sync up to the music that you're working with. So let's dig back into After Effects, and we'll go into this hit composition. So you can kind of see the layout. It looks pretty standard, but except for one cool thing, we have this background controller. If we dig into the demo on this hummingbird, you can see that I customized this hummingbird scene so it matched the colors of the hummingbird. And you can easily do that in your projects as well. So you can adjust the bokeh color just by selecting the color picker and selecting one of the color values in there. We'll select maybe a red from the scarf and a turquoise from the scarf, and then we'll lighten up that color A quite a bit. Maybe something like that. And then lighten up the B. And that's exactly how I did it in the demo. Okay, so I'll undo that. To render, how you do that is you can select it and then hit the hotkey Control Command M. But just the regular way would be to hit Composition and then Add to Render Queue. When it comes to rendering, what I recommend is to export out as uncompressed as possible and then bring those renders into Premiere and do your final video editing, finally exporting out from Premiere with your final export, like to YouTube or whatever. So what I recommend for export settings is, if you have access to it, I personally use ProRes 422. So the format is QuickTime. And then if you go to Format Options, I'll bring up this panel. If you have it under the video codec, I use ProRes 422. Now, if you don't have it, I would recommend using animation. And if you're worried about file size, because this will produce a larger file size, then I would use H.264. But just be aware that you're going to take a render hit. It's going to take quite a bit longer to render out an H.264 QuickTime file than it would a more uncompressed file like one with animation. And just as a quick reference for you guys, these take about, on my computer in HD, about 5 to 12 minutes each to render out. So if you render out in 4K, you can factor double that time. Let's dig into the in loop out. Now, how would you use this? If we go into Premiere, you can see that this has an in where the loop kind of slowly builds. And then at frame 120, or 4 seconds in, so right here, and I'm going to hold Command and click on this to select, so it's showing frames. At frame 120, this is where the loop starts. So I'm just going to hit C to slice and slice it right there, and then I'm going to play it forward. So we can see this is the loop right now that's happening. To frame 239, and we slice it right there. Now, what you can do to extend their duration, and a lot of people get this wrong. They think that they have to extend the duration in After Effects, but you don't have to do that. You just have to render the in loop out, and then you could have the effect build on. And then all you have to do is just delete this third part, and then take this part and hit Command C, go to the end, and paste it. And you can keep pasting it back to back to back and extend the duration for as long as you'd like. So that's how I'd recommend using the in loop out. And the loop that we have set up, this is literally just the middle part that we just saw of the in loop out. And what this is great for is GIFs, animated GIFs. I'm just going to very quickly go over with you my recommendations for animated GIFs with this project. My first recommendation is to think about how big is your final image going to be for your GIF. And when you're working with GIFs, you want to be very conscious of file sizes because you want them to be as small as possible. Now, this GIF will render out 4 seconds. Now, I typically on VideoHive, for when I make GIFs, I render them out so that the final GIF is 588 pixels wide by 331 high. And that 588 is the width of the description, if you're curious. And a lot of people ask me about GIFs, so I just wanted to be as clear as I can in this part of the tutorial. So what I would recommend is, rather than exporting out the HD size, I would set it up in HD, but then I would set up this loop to render out from After Effects at 588 by 331. So let me show you that example really quick. I'll just go and hit Command-Shift-M, and I have a GIF preset that I have right here, and I can show you this GIF preset. It's QuickTime ProRes 422. 588 by 331, and hit OK, and then you'd render that out, and then you would bring that render into Photoshop, which I've already done, and then the last step you would do is go to File, Export, and I still use Save for Web Legacy because I like to really play with the options in the GIF. I mean, there isn't a one-size-fits-all with this. There are a couple recommendations I will have though. Try to keep the colors to as few as possible within these specific numbers that they have. Like, I wouldn't recommend going to 16 and then going down to 15. Stay at 16. Keep the dithering as low as possible. That'll help the file size. And finally, of course, you want to change this from looping options once to forever. And this is not looking great, but it's also getting smaller too. So you just have to keep playing with these settings. So let's go into After Effects again and the reveal. Now, the reveal is really kind of best for slideshows. So we'll go into Premiere really quick and I'll show you the reveal. And that's kind of like a much more subtle version of the hit. It's a lot slower, it's a lot more elegant, and really this is made for slideshows. That's why I set it up, is so you could take this and let's say you wanted to make a slideshow for somebody for their wedding or whatever. So you just take the Shimmer Motion Kit and you'd create a bunch of examples and render out all the reveals. And then you'd bring them into Premiere, lay your audio track into there, and then I added a second one into here. And this one I didn't render out the full duration because this is actually from the demo that I used. But you can see like you would just lay these back to back and create a slideshow that way. And within After Effects, there's really nothing extra to see in here. But there is one thing I do want to note on the hit and the reveal, and that is that I added this marker. And this marker says set Z position to 0 for loop. And it's got an arrow. So if I go to this hit and I hit P, you can see that there's keyframes on the Z position. If I bring my current time indicator to this last keyframe, it's set to -200. Let's say, for example, I want the reveal to continue on longer than what it is. Well, the best way I would do that is by connecting it to a loop. So I'll bring that into there. But this won't actually sync up because see how there's a difference here in where the camera Z position is. And that's by default. Originally, I was going to have it loop up and not think anything of it. But I really didn't like when it hit right here, it pulling back to 0. So unless you have to sync it up with the loop, but that's how you would make it so you can extend it so it would reveal and then keep showing longer, is you would have this keyframe instead of -200 set to 0. And then finally, we have the time remap. So if we go into Premiere, the time remap is really awesome for intros, and you could use it for a logo sting as well. So I'll delete these, and then we'll drag this into there. And we can see this is what I used. I actually did use this instead of the hit on some of the examples in the demo. But I'll play it back one more time. So it kind of just hits on, it goes really aggressive and then slows and then comes back and kind of wiggles towards the end. One thing that's really cool that you can do with this is you can do a time remap with video. So let me show you what that looks like. I'll delete this one and play this. And then it comes back and the video continues on. So let me show you how I set this up in After Effects, and it's really easy. So what you're gonna do is run the Shimmer Motion Kit and insert your footage, except for in step 1, you're going to copy and then delete the footage. And instead you're gonna go to Other, and then go to Optional, and then Time Remap Source. And then in this composition, you're gonna paste that footage. So it says insert your footage into this. And this is just a guide layer, so don't really pay attention to this. It's not going to render or anything. But it says time remap freeze frame. So you want to get the frame. So this is footage in here. You want to get the frame exactly where you want it to freeze frame at 30 frames. So right here. And I just added the marker to try and kind of help you with it. So then what you do is just go into the rest of the project like you normally would. Go into the isolate, and that's going to have that freeze frame set up for you. So you're going to isolate that. You're going to add a focal area so you can see where I added the focal areas. You're going to go into the dancer example, bring your current time indicator over to where it says to edit, if you want to edit any of the particles or anything in here. And then finally, when you go to render, just go to the time remap and everything will be set up for you. All right, you guys, that is everything. Thanks again, you guys. Have a great day.